guys, what's up? Aru. Capitano's knowledge of the Abyss in the 5.2 Interlude quest might just be the key to actually defeating the Abyss, as well as uncovering the secret of Celestia and the ruler of death, Ronova. But that's not the only thing we've learned from the entire quest, because we've also learned more about the curse of Khaenri'ah's people, the power of the god of death Ronova, but also the rules of Celestia when it comes to managing the world of Teyvat, the exploits of Ronova using her rule of death to either bestow one's final rest, but also to bestow the immortality of undeath that Capitano is determined to uncover its reasons for Ronova cursing them with. And if you're a fan of Enkanomiya's Byaku Yakuku collection, then you might have also noticed a hint to the king and the parable of the tree. But if not, then I'll be here to help you understand Capitano's insights as well as the entirety of the interlude quest and its focus on the Abyss Corrosion syndrome as well as Capitano's drought of Lucidity. So as always, timestamps will be down below and I suggest liking and subscribing to see more of my content. Now remember what Capitano said about Ronova?
In the garden cultivated by the gods, flowers and weeds grow side by side. When the weeds compete for nutrients in the soil, the gardener intervenes to inhibit their growth. I'm not one to pass judgment based on my own standard of right and wrong. But it is an undeniable fact that she is responsible for my suffering, as well as that of my people. The ruler of death can freely define the form of death, or grant immortality to anyone she desires. Her power is a rule in and of itself. Faced with such an overwhelming level of power, it can feel hopeless to resist.
The garden cultivated by the gods where weeds and flowers grow and where the gardener intervenes with competing plants bears quite similar resemblance to the parable of the tree in Before the Sun and Moon. But the parable of the tree and the cautious words of Capitano about Ronova speak of the relationship between the heavenly principles, its shades, the ruler of death, and the ruler of time, Istaroth, with the missing characters being the gardener and the tree spirit. In Capitano's poetic words, he speaks of the ruler of death as a gardener of death, picking which flowers are left to grow and which weeds are to be cut off. It's also interesting that both death and immortality are entrusted to the ruler of death, and how Ronova as the ruler can freely define air quotes death and immortality to any way she desires and on anyone she wishes. It's as if death, transcendence, and ascension go hand in hand, and that Ronova herself can declare what deserves death and what deserves undeath, disrupting the natural cycle and creating individuals that can transcend mortality for their own agenda. This puts a big question mark as to why exactly Khaenri'ahs were cursed instead of outright killed through death's rule, and why Xbalanque was allowed the power of death to fight the Abyss, as well as why Mavuika has to submit herself to the rule of death, or, well, using the rule of death. Now, whether or not there's an underlying message that Capitano and Piero must uncover from their curse, or maybe it was Ronova's way of saving Khaenri'ah without submitting them to death or the Abyss entirely, is still unknown. Maybe death is the first true hurdle to accept in order for those who are cursed to finally realize their true mission or fate. Just like the Hilichurls who have accepted their fate once they have reached the end of their sanity or their life. One must first die to become a god, and one must face the rule of death to reach true godhood. This is even more apparent with Natlan's Archons, since every Archon in Natlan was a human. And for humans who ascend to godhood, we've already seen what happens to them. Now, as a fun bonus theory, I've also theorized that Dainsleif was this gardener since he was called the Bowkeeper, and that Dainsleif had feelings for Rukkhadevata, and that the Irminsul was located right in the middle of Khaenri'ah. But now it might also be possible that the captain was the gardener, since he has quite a backstory and a mission to the ruler of death. The tree spirit in this case I can only assume is Mavuika, going into the sacred flame and then going back out 500 years later, or rather an incarnation of Mavuika 500 years ago, or a god that the captain had feelings for when 6 out of the 7 Archons went to Khaenri'ah. This was mentioned by Rukkhadevata during our quest in Sumeru, and it's likely that it's one of the gods that solidified their seat before the Archon War. For everyone who wants a Mavuika / Capitano ship, there you go. So moving on to the main topic, the Abyss is one of the main antagonists of Genshin Impact, but it's also the only undefined and unfathomable antagonists of the game, which is why we have the many Lovecraft and Cthulhu mythos inspirations. Compared to Celestia, which we've known from Nuvolette, and the Narwhal boss as protecting us from the outside world, as well as Saritsa and the Fatui that wish to take all 7 Gnosis to either destroy the Abyss or destroy the old world, there's no proper way to describe what the Abyss is and why exactly, or at least vaguely, it wants to invade Teyvat. Sure, it's there to copy memories of Teyvat and mimic the world it consumes, but the one question that hasn't been answered yet is why? Why is the Abyss trying to invade Teyvat since before the Heavenly Principles? And why were the Dragon Lords of the Ancient Era being invaded for so long? A deadly yet also intoxicating poison to any non-Abyss aligned race or entity, and when left to fester can undoubtedly lead to one's ruin. In the latest Archon quest, rather interlude quest, we get a glimpse of one of the ways that the Abyss can infect and destroy living things from the inside. The captain calls this mental attack Abyss Corrosion Syndrome. Any form of exposure to abyssal corruption might simply lead to a slight infection like usual, but staying in the abyss-infected area for too long and being exposed to high amounts of abyssal concentration will lead to Abyss Corrosion Syndrome, where the mind is then fed on by the abyss, manifesting the underlying fears and anxieties of any person that come in contact with it. Superficial hallucinations that lead to mind-altering results, as well as losing the capacity to perceive the real world. We can see its varying effects and levels of corrosion from the interlude quest itself, from bringing back memories of drowning during childhood, past traumas of loss and grief, as well as perceived failures that one never wishes to experience, with the last being the worst, especially since it applies to what hasn't happened yet. If you're too exposed to abyssal corruption, then you may very well end up seeing the world as a torn landscape filled with nothing but monsters and shadows. This is even more lethal if the person infected has a strong will to survive and fight to the bitter end. But the effects of Abyssal Corrosion Syndrome isn't a new phenomenon, and based on Capitano, it has been a known illness that has already taken effect 500 years ago during the Cataclysm, and not just for the people of Khaenri'ah. In the beginning of the game, the Valen was the first case of Abyssal Corrosion Syndrome that we've seen, but we only call it a general form of abyssal corruption, which was then enhanced by the Abyss Order. Venti himself, the Anemo Archon, was also infected by this corrosion, and in Venti's words, it's a poison born from the darkness that degrades the body and mind. Now, someone else that would have lost their mind to the Abyss Corrosion Syndrome is Torachio, the Oni Tiger Bite, Swordmaster, as well as friend of the Raiden Shogun 500 years ago, being consumed by a beast of sin, painted by darkness, and then later turned her sword to the Shogun. In her Ascension material, it is said that corruption of that kind is theorized as non-monodirectional, meaning that it can happen and manifest in many different ways. And now this is proven to be true in Natlan. Mental and physical degradation occur at different rates based on the people that we've seen so far. If you could remember, Atea's physical degradation came before her mental loss, as well as Koichi's before she died. And as for Chaska, we'll talk about her in a later segment along with Child and Skirk. Now, another form of Abyssal Corrosion Syndrome might be the karmic debt that the Yaksha accumulate after fighting creatures infected by karma for too long, leading to hallucinations, insanity, as well as harming their allies. And we all know what happened with the other Yakshas. Exposure to a single high concentration of the Abyss isn't really different from constant small doses after every battle. And a fatal wound to a dragon is also no different from being eaten alive by a beast of sin. Now, this might not be a direct relation to Abyss Corrosion Syndrome, but it's still worth discussing when it comes to abyssal corruption's various ways of adapting to whatever it is they're trying to invade. Eleazar in Sumeru is tied to the Withering, which originated from forbidden knowledge, an unfathomable truth that comes from the very bottom of the abyss, wherever that bottom is. Eleazar is said to be tied to the level of elemental content within the person. This is based off of Zandik or the Torre's notes about curing and and even weaponizing Eleazar. People who suffered from Eleazar seem to have been born with it, and that it reacts depending on the elemental content of a person. Abnormal levels of elemental content can cause a rise in the effects of Eleazar as a result. This means that if you were born with elemental aptitude, which is as rare as vision bearers, then you basically lost that potential due to the causal effect of Eleazar. But this could also mean that forbidden knowledge is directly tied to the elemental power that a human can have, very much similar to the Dragon Lord's blessing in Natlan, but for humans. But we've already cured the withering in Sumeru, so Eleazar wouldn't be a problem anymore. And also expect Donyerzad to be either a vision bearer or a visionless elemental user in the future. Now the other one is a patient of the Tori, Kale, first mentioned in the Genshin manga. Kali is a bit of a Frankenstein's monster due to having naturally high elemental content, which in turn raises her Eleazar, as well as being infused with god remains, which are residues of fallen gods, during either the Archon War or possibly even an older time. Yeah, Kali tanked through 3 ailments through her childhood, but today the god remains were sealed as well as the Eleazar being removed, so happy Kali. Not exactly. Whatever god remains she had inside her is only dormant, which means that it can reawaken and take control of her completely. This is quite unsettling since we don't exactly know what specific remains of a god was infused into Kale, but it manifests itself as a serpent as well as giving Kale an unstable power over black serpent flames. Serpent flames that also have quite a level of hatred towards Venti's statue. This black serpent might be the remains of Orobashi in Inazuma, or an even older serpent that hates the Archons in general, or the god of time, which is called the Thousand Winds, Istaroth, or Celestia and humanity in general, which is exactly what the Abyss was once told to us about by Venti. Now, one of the corrosion-stricken Natlanese people in the interlude quest speak of her manifesting revelation about the Abyss. Now, if she were to slowly succumb to that madness, she'd probably reach some form of forbidden knowledge or truth or even whispers of the Abyss. Weirdly enough, Eleazar, which is directly connected to forbidden knowledge, also means God has help. Now, whoever named it is either infected by the Abyss or had researched the origin through Deshret himself, and forbidden knowledge is also the main reason the 5 sinners of Khaenri'ah turned to the Abyss. Now, whoever that god of the Abyss is that whispers into people just like the sinner in the chasm, Vedrfolnir, I can only hope that it's the kind of god that displays the same symptoms as being infected by abyssal corrosion. The 5 sinners also willingly embraced this based on what we know so far, compared to the people who fear or combat the effects of the Abyss. And the whispers of the Abyss might also be a symptom of Abyss Corrosion Syndrome. Fragmented souls like Auroron can be infected by lingering souls connected to certain people, like Gutherd and Capitano, and if left unchecked, it might end up with the same effect as the god remains that Kale experienced. Bear in mind, the Abyss adapts to whatever it invades and uses whatever it finds to its advantage, from souls of the Night Kingdom to slain gods to even related thoughts and clinging souls. And the Abyss is not a mindless entity either. It has its own mind and voice, which we could find from the Kitsune Saigu and the Dark Will in Inazuma, of which is also present today in Natlan through Chaska, which again we'll talk about in her segment with Child. What makes this abyssal corrosion more dangerous is the fact that it not only brings up your fears and desires in such twisted ways, but the only way of cleansing it is through what the captain calls the Draught of Lucidity, created at the cost of a self-imposed experiment by Gutherd. Now, lucidity means to return to mental consciousness or clarity before one's death. This is greatly similar to the return of clarity that Hilichurls experience during the end of their long-endured curse, becoming less rabid or feral, now more peaceful and only searching for the light that calms them down. The mental turmoil is the same for both pure-blooded and half-blooded Khaenri'ahns as well. So could this lucidity be from the same origin as the Shard of the Abyss Order used to cure the cursed Khaenri'ahns? This cure, however, is not exclusive to the Draught of Lucidity. Venti uses the Windrise tree to cure the poison which originated from Durin on Dvalin, and Sumeru's forests as well as Nilotpala lotuses have alleviating properties against Eleazar, which, if you could remember, was from forbidden knowledge. What's interesting is that Nilotpala lotuses have a big connection to the Moon Sisters and the Sun Chariot. Remember the theories that Nahida was a Moon Sister? Yeah, those theories have never really left the lore sphere. And Venti, on the other hand, could be healed by the effects of Windrise, which is where Vanessa ascended to Celestia. Now Celestia, from what we know, can remove the Abyss, but we don't know how specifically or from what power, which means that the remnants of Moon Sisters and Moon Sisters as a whole have the power to heal or even remove Abyssal Corrosion. This reason is very important because Khaenri'ah worship moons, and the Moon Sisters' corpses have been theorized to be in Khaenri'ah as Abyss deities. Perenheri was the best depiction of that religion, which would mean that before the Cataclysm, Khaenri'ah still had some connection to one of the fallen Moon Sisters, either from the Crimson Moon or the Eclipse era. If it's from the Crimson Moon, then we all know the effects of drinking blood of the fallen Moon Sister from Arlecchino. So could have Guthred been able to purify the effects of the Crimson Bale Moon? It's possible since during the Eclipse dynasty, very few remain knowledgeable and even devout to the Crimson Moon dynasty. And Guthred could be one of those few remaining Khaenri'ahs with that same bloodline, turning the once Bale Moon bloodfire, a curse and blessing of their bloodline, into a medicine to remove the effects of the Abyss. Now on the other side of having the Abyss in your head, we have those that give in to the effects of the Abyss. Both Chaska and Child have an inborn hunger for conflict as well as the Abyss clinging to their soul. But compared to Child, Chaska's lore highlights the foothold of the Abyss as a voice in her head, a whisper of darkness that could be similar to the Kitsune Saigu as well as Torachio, one almost succumbing to it and the other being taught to hone it as a weapon. We all know that Child was able to harness the destruction from within him through Skirk, and this then became his foul legacy, which originated from Sirtology, the Foul's legacy. But this can only occur when someone is knowledgeable and has the means to harness that Abyss without falling prey to it. For Chaska, she sadly has no one to teach her how to properly harness her Abyssal curse, but she also did not give in to that Abyss. In the end, she chose to confront it like a lingering second voice in her head. And interestingly, we almost saw the extent of that curse flaring up during 5.1, only to be put in its place again by Chaska. Bear in mind, she didn't defeat the Abyss inside her, but she controlled it. Based on these two rare anomalies as well as the sinners and their accomplices, it might be possible to use the Abyss or coexist with the Abyss. It sounds heretical, I know, but it's a far cry to what the Abyss has already done to those with less courage and even less willpower to keep their sanity amidst chaos. And there we go, my thoughts on the 5.2 Archon quest, as well as some theory mixed in about Capitano and Ronova. I honestly thought at first that Capitano was just more caring toward Natlan since they fought way back in the Cataclysm, but now it's a bit clearer that he has some grudge over Ronova, and he doesn't want Natlan to suffer the same fate. Or, you know, he's a simp for Mawika. Natlan itself is also at the cusp of almost calling the Heavenly Principles, not just because of its technology as well as being the region where the Abyss attacked during the Cataclysm, but also because Natlan was the most exposed to the Abyss during the Heavenly War. It's the reason Xbalanque had to make a deal with Ronova, but hopefully Xbalanque's plan is enough to hide their secret deal from the Heavenly Principles' eyes. Anyway, that's gonna be it for this video. I still need to go through Ochka Natlan, as well as trying to make sure that this PC is working perfectly when it comes to recording and streaming. So I'll see you guys in the next video, yeah? Like, comment if you enjoyed, subscribe and hit the bell for more of my ramblings, and stay mad theorist. Bye!